Hello, welcome. This is Jennifer, and as always, I'm very thankful you're here. Today, I am revisiting shaker cards and sharing a layered shaker card technique. Now, I have done many shaker card videos in the past. In fact, I will link to a playlist of the videos in my description below and at the end of this video if you want to check them out. Today is about creating shaker cards with layering dies so that you can get a lot of dimension and that movement of sparkle. Now, I will have some tips for creating these type of shaker cards with basic dies too. We've got a lot to share, so it's best we get started. Here's our first card, and notice those are shaker windows with layered die cuts on top. The die set I'm using for this is from Pretty Pink Posh, and it's called Build a Stocking Die Set. There are different size stockings and different options, different ways to decorate them, all included in one set. I'm using the 3 stocking dies that you see on the right to create my shaker window. This will actually have 3 shaker windows, but don't worry, it's not hard to create. I have 2 pieces of navy cardstock that are cut to the same size, 4 by 5 1/4 inches. I'm placing my 3 stocking dies on one of the pieces, trying to line them up across the center, but it doesn't have to be perfect. I ran that through my die cut machine, and now I have the 3 windows for the 3 stockings. Now I need to cut the same stockings positioned in the same spot on the other piece of blue cardstock. Now there are a few ways to do this, but I find the easiest is to hold the solid piece behind the one we've already die cut and line them up. I then lay that onto my cutting plate and pop the dies into the opening. These will pop in very nicely, kind of fit like a puzzle piece. And then once I have them all popped in place, I will run this through my die cut machine. This will cut those same stocking images in the same spot on that piece of cardstock that's behind the one we just cut. Now you'll notice because my cardstock's so thick, that back piece here didn't cut all the way through. That's okay, there's an impression there, and all I have to do is pop the dies into that impression and run it through, and that will complete the cut. And we will end up with these 2 pieces of the same size, same color, and the windows cut in the same spot. By the way, this is Lawn Fawn Blue Jay cardstock, such a beautiful color. Now I'm going to set one of these aside for later, and we'll start with one of the panels with the 3 stocking windows. I'm going to trim just a little bit off each edge, less than 1/8 of an inch, just trim a hair off. This really isn't necessary, but if you're like me and not great at lining things up, taking the time to cut a little bit off of the 4 sides will make a big difference for you. On the back of this piece, I'll put some strong adhesive. I'm using Gina K Connect in a fine tip bottle. Any strong adhesive would work well here. I will then place this onto a 4 1/4 by 5 1/2 inch white note card. I do like to put something heavy on that to make sure it makes a good connection. Into each of those stocking openings, I'll glue different colors of stocking elements. These are all created with that same die set. If you want to save time, you could just do solid colors of cardstock instead. On one, I'll do polka dots. On one, I'll do a solid stocking with a tree on it. And on the other, I will create little stripes. Creating stripes on this was easy. There are faux stitching lines that the die creates. I'm putting liquid adhesive in between those faux stitching lines and just adding thin strips of cardstock that I cut with my trimmer. After I glued a few down, I'll trim off the excess and use the leftover pieces until I have a stocking with stripes covering it. Now this is all about the details for me. I enjoy putting these details in, but you could totally skip them and go for a simpler look if you prefer. Now for the polka dot stocking, I am going to add little light blue die cut dots into the openings. I enjoy fiddling with little die cuts like this. If you don't enjoy doing this, you could instead add a solid light blue stocking behind the polka dot one, and then the light blue would show through. Or you could color in the white opening with a light blue marker and then add the darker polka dot piece on top. There are many options you could do to simplify this card, but I, again, am all about those details. And the fun thing about this card is all of these details will be inside of our shaker window. Usually we leave our shaker windows plain. This will add a lot of interest. Okay, so now it's time to build the walls of our shaker window around these stockings. There are many ways to make the walls, but today I am using the Gina K Designs shaker strips. These are thick enough for a shaker window, and they're narrow so you can get into those tight areas. Now, I'll be honest, I've had these for a while, and I hadn't tried them until last week, and now I can't get enough of them. The nice thing is they're easy to cut and they're easy to tear, which is a big bonus for me. Also, the release paper from it comes off easily, which is another thing I like in my foam tape. I don't use foam tape very often, but when I do, I want it to be easy to work with, and these definitely are. I will use another kind later in this video, but you'll see they're not as easy to work with, but it is another option. Now, if you don't have foam tape, you could build up scraps of cardstock, thin strips. You can glue together maybe 4 or 5 thick and form the walls that way. But this is definitely the easiest route to go. Notice that I divided each of the stockings, so there are 3 different wells for our shaker bit. You could do one big well if you wanted to, but this will give more support to the top of the card. Next, I'm using an anti-static powder tool to add the powder along the sides of the foam tape in each of the wells. This is the This Calls for Confetti anti-static powder tool. It's kind of like a wand, so you can easily rub the powder along the inside edges of the foam tape. If you have a different anti-static powder tool, you definitely could use that, but this is nice because you can get it into those tight nooks and crannies and make sure that none of your shaker bits stick to the side of the foam tape. This makes a big difference. Later on, I create a card and I forget to do this step, and you'll see that my little confetti pieces stick to the walls. Now that the back and walls of our shaker wells are ready, let's do the front piece. We'll take the other blue panel where we die cut those 3 stockings. On the back of it, I will put strong double-sided tape and then lay a piece of clear acetate. You can see the clear piece up on the top right. I'm using Simon Says Stamp lightweight acetate, but you could definitely use recycled materials for this. I just happened to use up all of my recycling, so I chose the lightweight acetate from Simon Says Stamp. So I put the double-sided tape on the back of our stocking piece and I'll lay the acetate on it, and now you can see how we have our shaker window front. Now we can put it all together. We just need to add some shaker bits into each of the wells. Now there are lots of things you could add in here. I'm adding little iridescent confetti pieces. I like to use something that's clear, maybe iridescent, so that it doesn't distract from the stockings that I put inside. However, you can really put anything you want into these shaker wells. Pretty Pink Posh has a lot of different options of sequins, pearls, gems, shaker bits, and more. Lots of great options. I'm just going with simple iridescent confetti pieces. Now I will remove the release paper from these foam tape strips, and you can see they removed very easily. And then on top of the foam tape, I'm putting some liquid adhesive. This is optional, but it helps to give you a little wiggle room time when we put the top onto this. You could skip it if you want to. I just find it a bit helpful because I don't always line things up just right. Then we can take our shaker front that has the acetate on it and lay it down there, lining up the stockings on our card with the stockings on that top window. Then I'll put something heavy on that while that liquid adhesive dries. Now this is the fun part. I used the Pretty Pink Posh layering stocking set. So there are these layering die cuts, including the toes of the stockings and the top of the stockings. I'm going to glue these onto the top of the shaker window, which just makes it more special. Usually with shaker windows, we just do like say a circle and that's the shaker window. We may glue a sentiment on top. But in this case, we're gluing some of the layering elements on top. We could have glued the polka dots on top and the tree on top and the stripes on top. That's another option. But I chose just to do the toe, the stocking topping, and that little loop at the top. After I've added those elements, it's time to add a sentiment. I chose a simple sentiment. This is the Pretty Pink Posh Merry Script die. I die cut it 3 times from white cardstock, glued those together for stacked dimension, and then I'm adding that right across the shaker windows. Again, we're layering lots of stuff on top of the shaker windows so that the shaker windows become more of a background element instead of the focal point, and it's really fun to create it this way. Now it's time just to add some accents. I'm using the Pretty Pink Posh Holiday Mug Edition die set. Now these are little dies that are meant to go with a holiday mug die set that Pretty Pink Posh has. I thought some of these elements would be nice at the top of our stockings, and you'll see me use even more of these elements later in this video. So here is a look at our completed card. It's 4¼ by 5½ inches. I did add some silver gemstones as berries at the top of each stocking. So what's different about this card is I used a layering die set, and I made the large base of it, which is the stocking shape, the shaker window, and then I glued all of the layered elements on top of that, which includes the top of the stocking, the little hook, and the toe. And then I added the sentiment right across that. I love that the shaker element is just part of the card. It's incorporated in the design, and it adds a lot of sparkle and interest. It really doesn't take that much more time than creating the same card without the shaker feature using the same products. Now, if you prefer to do stamping, you could do the same card with the Pretty Pink Posh Holiday Stocking Stamp Set. There's a coordinating die set that lines up with it. So what you could do is, instead of assembling those polka dot, tree, and striped stockings in the window, you could stamp them and then add the other stamped elements die cut on top of the shaker window. So definitely can do this technique using stamp sets and coordinating dies. This brings me to my next example, and in this case, I'm again using a layering die set and creating a shaker window. But you could do a similar design with a circle die and then add die cuts on top. For this, I'm using the Pretty Pink Posh Love from Afar die set. I really liked the set when I saw it. I love the large world image and then the different letter sentiments that you can use with the banner die. I'll use one on this card and on another card later in this video. Once again, I've cut 2 pieces of dark blue cardstock to 4 by 5¼ inches. I'm using the globe circle die and placing it towards the top center of one of the panels, and I'll run that through my die cut machine, cutting that window. Now I want to cut the window in the same spot on the other blue piece, so I'll use the same trick as before. I will line up the second piece behind our die cut one, making sure the sides are lined up. I'll pop that circle die into the window, run that all through my die cut machine, and that will cut the circle in the second piece in the same spot as the first. Once again, I'll take one of these pieces and set it aside for later use. On the other piece, I'll trim a little bit off of all 4 sides. Again, just a hair, less than 1/8 of an inch. You'll notice there's already glue on this. That's because I forgot to do this step, so I had to backtrack. Now I'll put some fresh glue on it and then add it to the front of a 4¼ by 5½ inch white note card. Again, you don't need to trim that excess off the side if you don't want to, but I find it's easier when you're lining things up later on. Okay, now into that opening, that circle opening, I'll add a light blue die cut that I created with that same globe die. Now this die actually creates little waves and some faux stitching, so it adds a little bit of interest inside of that circle. Now we'll take the other blue piece where we die cut the circle from the center, and on the back of this we'll add a piece of acetate. So I'll flip it over, add double-sided tape all around the edges, and lay my acetate piece onto it. Once that front piece is ready, I'll set it aside. It's time to build the walls of our shaker window. I once again am reaching for the Gina K Designs shaker strips. These are just fantastic, and I already placed another order for more today. And I'm placing these around that round window. But while I'm doing this, let me tell you another way that you can create the shaker walls. And I've shown this in videos before. That is, you want to die cut like 4 or 5 of those blue panels with the circle, and make sure that circle is cut in the same place every time, just as I demonstrated earlier. You can glue 4 or 5 of those panels together, and that will form that well for all of your shaker bits. It really just depends on how you prefer to do it. I normally don't like to use a lot of foam tape, but I felt it was definitely worth it for this card design. And there you can see how I've created that well for our shaker bits around that light blue circle. I once again am using my anti-static powder tool to apply some powder just on the inside edges of that shaker well. I don't want anything sticking on it, and believe it or not, this makes a big difference. Once I've applied the powder, I can just blow the rest off, or I can use one of those air cans to kind of knock all the powder out of the way. Into this, I am adding a lot of those little mini confetti sequins. I just wanted to have a lot of sparkle moving around inside of this large shaker window. Once I remove the release paper from all the foam tape, I can add the blue panel with the acetate window right on top, lining up the circles. And look at how those little pieces move around so freely inside. Now remember, this globe die set is a layering die set. So I cut the next layer from green cardstock and I'm gluing that right on top of the acetate using liquid adhesive. You'll want to use something strong, or you can use double-sided tape. So now the layering elements are actually on top of the shaker window. So we have a layered shaker window once again. One of the reasons I really like this particular die set is the banner die that's included, and then 3 different sentiments. And these cut individual little letters. So I die cut from white cardstock using the banner die. Now I'm lining up one of the sentiment dies on top of that, and I'll run that through my die cut machine. This will cut out the little letters so that I can put a colored piece of cardstock behind it. Now that would be the easiest way to do this. Just put a strip of navy cardstock behind that. But you know me, and I like to fiddle with those tiny little die cuts. So instead, I'm gluing this onto a white die cut. Then I'll cut the individual letters from the dark blue cardstock and glue it into each of those little openings, creating a die cut inlay look. Now this definitely would have been faster if I just did colored cardstock showing through each of those letter openings. But to each their own. By the way, I did do this in black cardstock instead, just so that the sentiment would stand out more. So now we have Love from Afar on our white banner. I will layer this on top of our shaker window also, and then add the little ends of the banner to the left and the right. From the same die set, I created 2 little layered birds that I added above and below the sentiment. And then I die cut a bunch of hearts using a Simon Says stamp heart die you can see at the top of the screen. Now this Pretty Pink Posh globe die set actually comes with a little heart, but I'll be honest, when I was working, I lost that heart on my desk and I didn't recover it until later, so I chose to use this heart die set instead. So here is our completed card. It's 4 1/4 by 5 1/2 inches, and you can see how those shaker bits, that sparkle inside of the globe, moves around very freely and adds so much sparkle and interest to this card design. So I used a layering die set, and I used the base of it, which is that circle or the globe, to create a shaker window, and I added all of the other elements on top of the shaker window. I think this is just a fun way to shake up your layering die sets. This brings me to my next example, and this one actually uses a die that's intended to create shaker cards. And I'm going to show you a different way to build the walls of your shaker window, and then we'll layer on top of it once again. Let's start with the background first. I have a piece of dark blue cardstock that is 4 by 5 1/4 inches, and I'm using the Pretty Pink Posh Winter Word Stencil on top. Now I place my cardstock piece into my MISTI stamping tool that also has a waffle flower grip mat in it. That's a clear mat that will hold my cardstock and stencil in place as we do the inking on top. But you could use temporary tape, a sticky mat, whatever you have. Now over the stencil, I'm applying Simon Says Stamp Positively Saturated ink in the royal color, which is a nice dark blue. This is slightly darker than the blue cardstock I'm using, so we'll have a nice tone-on-tone look. You definitely could do a fun technique here if you prefer, but I'm going with basic stenciling. Once I'm done, I can remove the stencil, give it a little spritz of rubbing alcohol to clean off that excess ink, and we have a nice tone-on-tone background for the backdrop of our card. For the shaker window, I'm using the Pretty Pink Posh Stockings Shaker die set. It comes with the stocking and the tree die that you see over there on the right. Pretty Pink Posh has many shaker dies like this that make creating shaker windows super easy. I love these designs. I use the die to cut from white cardstock 6 times. I will glue 5 of them together so I have a nice thick stacked die cut. And that opening on the stocking will be our shaker well. So we are forming the walls of the shaker card by stacking up 5 or 6 die cuts. This is another way to form a shaker window if you don't want to use foam tape. And you can use scraps for this. Use mess up pieces of white cardstock where you messed up your stamping. No one will ever see them under all the layers. Once I have those 5 glued together, I will glue this stacked die cut onto our blue background. Make sure that you put glue all the way around so you completely seal it. I use the same stocking die to cut from teal cardstock, and I'll glue the solid piece right into the opening. So this will be kind of the backdrop for our shaker window area. Now into this little shaker well, you can add whatever you want as long as it's not thicker than the walls of your shaker window. This time I thought I'd add some little die cuts. These are candy die cuts that I created using the holiday mug add-on die set that I showed you earlier. I created them from white cardstock and silver glitter cardstock, and I thought those would be fun to move around inside of our shaker window. At this point, I'm not sure what else I want to put in that shaker window, so while I think about it, I'll go ahead and create the front of our shaker window. So I have my 6th white stocking die cut. On the back of it, I'll put some strong adhesive and add it to a piece of acetate. Along this top area, I'll use double-sided tape, but that would be too tricky around the outline of the stocking, so I'll just use liquid adhesive for that portion. I then can place it onto a piece of clear acetate and put something heavy on it while it dries. While that dries, let's finish filling our shaker well. This time I decided to use some teal color sequins that would match the teal backdrop of our stocking, so they wouldn't be too distracting. But again, you can put anything in here that isn't thicker than the walls of our shaker window. Okay, so once I'm happy with what I have in there, I can go back to the front of our shaker window and then trim off any of that excess acetate that's hanging outside of the white die cut. Thankfully, this is a pretty easy shape to cut around, so fussy cutting is quite simple. Now I can put strong liquid adhesive on the top of our shaker walls. So right on top of these stacked white die cuts, make sure you go all the way around so you have a complete seal. Then you can add your shaker window right on top. And there we have a stocking shape shaker window. It's actually pretty fast to assemble once you've done it once or twice, and it is definitely worth it for all the shaker fun inside. Now you can add layers on top of your shaker window. I'm first die cutting 2 more white stockings and just cutting off the top of the stocking, and I'll glue those onto my card just so that the top of the stocking sticks out from the shaker window. You definitely could skip these layers if you want to. I just like that layered detail. Then I added a few other accent die cuts at the top using that holiday mug edition die set I showed you earlier. We have some little pine pieces, a bow, some little holly sprigs, and some little gemstones. Now for a sentiment, I used that globe die set I showed you earlier, and this time I used Joy to the World, and I made the letters a bright blue, and I placed that right on top of our shaker window. So this one has less layering on top of the shaker window, but I did still add elements on top, which really stepped up the design. You could definitely keep this one simpler if you prefer. But I gotta say, my favorite part is that banner. I just love the Joy to the World and how it would work across pretty much any card design you do. Okay, let's move on to another shaker window card design where we're doing some layering. This time I used a layering word die set for the shaker window. It looks pretty subtle in the video, but it definitely catches the light with lots of moving sparkle in real life. For the layered word shaker window, I'm using the Pretty Pink Posh Merry Christmas shadow dies. It has the dies Merry Christmas and the shadow dies. Notice there are hot foil plates for Merry Christmas available that coordinate, but I'm not using those today, just the dies. So I'm taking the shadow for the words Merry Christmas and I'm placing them at the center of a 4 by 5 1/4 inch piece of that same dark blue cardstock. Once I come up with a color combination, I like to use it a few times. Color combinations are hard for me, so once I find one that I'm happy with, I use it several times. So I'm placing those right in the center and I'll run that through my die cut machine. This time I'm only doing one blue panel. On the back of that panel, I'll put some strong double-sided adhesive and then lay a piece of clear acetate on it. This will form the front of our shaker window. For this example, I'm assembling the walls of the shaker a little bit different than I did the others. This time, on the back of that shaker window, I'm placing my foam strips. I'm again using those Gina K Design shaker strips because they're so easy to work with. And I'll make sure that I'm surrounding those sentiment openings, making sure it's sealed so none of our shaker bits will fall out. I can fill that well with any little bits that I want. I chose to use some iridescent gemstones this time. I had accidentally spilled them all on my desk. So instead of putting them back in the container, I just put them in my shaker well. And I added a few little flat sequins too. Now this time I'll remove the release paper from this foam tape and I'll lay onto it another piece of clear acetate. So there's clear acetate on the front and the back. This is a little bit of a different assembly than the other ones we did. So now we have this shaker card front that we can add onto our card however we want. As I've said many times, there are many ways to put together shaker windows, and I just wanted to show you this option too. Now on to that acetate piece, I'll put some double-sided tape and then remove the release paper and add it right onto our card, which is a 4 1/4 by 5.5 inch white note card. Now we can add our layered die cuts onto the shaker window, and in this case, they're the sentiments themselves. So I die cut Merry Christmas twice from bright blue cardstock and glued them together for some stacked dimension. Then I put liquid adhesive on the back of the die cuts and I'm gluing them right onto the acetate window. So our shaker windows have these sentiments floating on the front. So you won't see a ton of the shaker movement through this, but in real life, the movement catches the light really nicely and adds a lot of fun. So that layered sentiment shaker window really doesn't take long to create, and you can decorate around it however you want. I chose to use the Pretty Pink Posh Holiday Bird die set because it is absolutely adorable, and I assembled 3 bird die cuts just following the examples they have on their website. I then glued those little birds around the sentiment, so we're just layering more on top of that shaker window. Those little birds took me about 20 minutes to put together, but you definitely could do a simpler design if you prefer. Now here, when I tilted in the light, you can see all of those little gemstones shaking around behind the sentiment, really drawing your eye to it. If you want it to stand out more, you can use more bold colors of gemstones, but I don't want it to be too distracting. By the way, if you don't like assembling little bird die cuts, there is a bird stamp set from Pretty Pink Posh. It's the Winter Bird stamp set. You could stamp, color, and die cut those and add those around the sentiment instead. Also, I'm very sorry if you can hear noise in the background. I have a basement full of teenagers, like 75 teenagers for Young Life, and I just couldn't avoid the noise. Okay, I have one last card for you. This is kind of a bonus card because it doesn't involve layering over a shaker window, but instead using a background die. There are many background dies with openings that would work for this kind of design. This is the Pretty Pink Posh tree cover plate die. It has that detailed plate die that cuts trees of different patterns, and then also teeny tiny dies that you can use to decorate the trees. I'm only using the background die today. I cut it twice from that blue cardstock. On the back of one of them, I'm putting double-sided tape, and then I will lay a piece of acetate. This will form the front of our shaker window, like we've done many times in this video. I then can set that aside, and I'll take the other tree die cut and I'll trim a little bit off of each side. Again, you can skip this, but I find it helpful in lining things up. This will get glued onto the front of our note card. This note card's a little bit bigger. It is 5 3/4 by 4.5 inches, just so that there'll be a nice trim around this blue die cut, which is 4 1/4 by 5.5. So I'll glue this one right in the center. Now I have a lot of teal and green and blue cardstock scraps left over from the previous cards in this video, so I die cut using that background die lots of trees from the scraps, and I'm gluing those right into the openings on our dark blue background. I did a mix of the different patterns so I could change things up. This is an excellent way to use up some of your scraps. So each of these will get glued into those little openings. Once I've filled them, I can also add in the polka dots on the polka dot tree. Now, I like adding in those little die cuts, as I've mentioned. If you don't like doing that, you could instead put color behind the dot openings, and then that color would show through. There are many ways to add colors here, and I just encourage you to do whatever makes you happy. Okay, so once I have those little trees assembled, it's time to form the walls for our shaker well. If you wanted to keep this simple, you could just put foam tape along the outside edges, like along the outside edges of that dark blue rectangle. However, I wanted to make sure that the shaker bits would stay around each tree. And to do so, I'm going to put foam tape in between each tree. This really doesn't take that long to do, and it really makes it so that you see more of the sparkle. Since these trees are close together, I needed a foam tape that is more narrow. Now, the kind that I'm using here is very inexpensive. It's narrow, it's not as thick, but the release paper is really hard to pull off, and it's kind of hard to cut and tear. So I don't reach for this one that often. I only use it if I need something super narrow, and I'm just too lazy to cut my wider foam tape narrow. I will link to this option below too. This time I'm using iridescent stars to fill in the wells. You could do something different in each of the wells, but I decided to keep it simple by doing the same in all of them. Now, using the tip of my X-Acto knife or a piercer, I'm hooking the release paper so that I'm able to remove it. And then I can place our shaker window front right on top, lining up the trees. So now you can see how the little iridescent stars shake in each of the windows, but you're still able to see the bright trees behind it. Now for a sentiment, I'm using the Pretty Pink Posh Christmas Sentiment Strip stamp set. I like this because it's small, has a great price point, and has lots of different options included. These are great for stamping on the inside of cards too. I stamped 3 of the sentiments with black ink on white cardstock strip. And then I am gluing additional cardstock strips behind it. These are just some scraps and will give it some nice dimension, and it'll hold up well during the mail. You could also use a foam tape strip here. I'm gluing the 3 sentiments right along the 3 rows of trees. Here's a closer look at the completed card. I love all the faux stitching detail around those trees, and then the colorful trees that are inside of those shaker windows. Now, there are 1,000,001 ways you can use a background die like this, but making little shaker windows really makes it special. So I hope you are inspired to kind of step up your shaker window game by using layering dies or adding die cuts on top of your shaker windows. It's a great way to get a new look from products you have. I will link below to the products I used, but keep in mind, these are Pretty Pink Posh products that came out a while ago. They do have a new release that's just coming out that's worth checking out too. I'll link to that also. Here on the screen, I have a link to my shaker video playlist and a link to my blog if you want to bookmark a card for future reference. Thanks for watching. We'll see you soon.